All right, so comrades, I think we're going to start. Welcome to everybody to this meeting at AIDC. My name is Sandra van Niekerk. For those who don't know me, I'm currently working for, should I use this?
Yeah, just use the sound.
I'm currently, I just switched it on. Hello? All right. So I'm currently working for Public Services International, PSI, which is a global federation of public sector trade unions, and which is very committed to the idea of energy as a public good, and has been working with AIDC, with TUID, Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, for a long time on building the body of evidence around the need to see energy as a public good and to see the transition towards a low carbon economy as a publicly led and driven process. So welcome to this meeting, and I believe we've got a large number of people on Zoom. So welcome to those people. You were very wise to avoid the traffic. I'm not going to spend long giving introductions. I think we've got two very able speakers. This is not a new issue. You know, the load shedding has been going on a very long time. We've been dealing with load shedding since 2008, on and off. It's got a long history, but clearly it's not getting resolved. And the government seems completely incapable of actually resolving the crisis of load shedding, of electricity, of increasing access to electricity to those who don't have electricity, who are suffering from energy poverty. So, you know, these are all questions that are not being dealt with adequately by the government. And I think AIDC and TUID have been doing a huge body of work in developing alternatives to the solution. So let me hand over first to
me.
Dominic. Sorry. Dominic's going to start. He's going to start by focusing in on the South African situation, to look at the alternatives, look at possible ways forward, and then he's going to be followed by Sean, who will take a step back and give a bit more of a look at the kind of impetus, international impetus towards seeing electricity and energy as a public good, and the possibilities that exist by following that road. If it's all right with you, I want to suggest that we have both speakers and that we then open up for discussion. I think it's going to, you know, because I think, you know, rather than have one speaker and then discussion and then another speaker, they're both talking to much the same set of issues, and I think it would be richer if we can finish the two inputs and then open for discussions. I see nodding heads, so I'm going to take that as acceptable. All right, so let me hand over then to Dominic. I don't think Dominic needs any introduction. Dominic Brown, Director of AIDC.
Thanks, Sandra. And appreciate everyone for joining what I think is a very important discussion. I want to start by saying that as AIDC, myself, and those we work with, sorry?
Can I just share the screen on Zoom?
Oh yes, sorry, for our comrades on Zoom, let me share screen. Okay, so I think I want to start out by saying that we recognize and acknowledge the urgency of the climate crisis, and we accept the climate science that says that we have less than a decade to avert runaway climate catastrophe. And we recognize as well that South Africa is a major contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. Depending on who you cite, between the 12th and the 14th biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. in the world. And this is in part as a result of the dependence and continued dependence on the mineral energy complex. But it's also, which relates to it, a big contribution of energy and a highly energy intensive economy. And so decarbonizing the energy sector would make a major contribution to shifting South Africa on a path towards a low carbon economy. However, I think many of us recognize that load shedding is the immediate crisis. But what we are saying, we are arguing, would lay the basis for, if driven to a public pathway approach, for an accelerated shift to a low carbon economy. Now, South Africa, and Sean, I shall say, will pick up on this in greater detail. In the first instance, I'll be arguing, and AIDC argues, that a major aspect of dealing with the immediate load shedding and energy crisis, which we'll unpack in greater detail, would require fixing the current fleet, which is a major contributor to the current highly energy intensivity of the country. Now, load shedding, last year, we experienced more than 150 days, which was approximately double in the amount of hours than we experienced in 2021. And this year is expected to be a lot worse. There's lots of fidgeting going on everywhere. No, it's not just you. And we recognize, I think, in South Africa that this has major detrimental impacts to the economy, to livelihoods, etc. And so we need to address the energy crisis as a matter of urgency. So tracing what is behind the energy crisis, currently it's an issue of demand outstripping energy supply. And on average, as a country, we have a gap, an energy gap of 6 gigawatts, where demand is more than energy. And behind this is the failing energy availability factor, or how much energy Eskom actually produces over time in comparison to its nominal capacity, installed capacity, which is now below, the energy availability factor is below 60%. Behind this is a massive increase in unplanned outages as the coal fleet collapses over time. And we've seen a major increase in the level of outages of the coal-fired power stations. And these are unplanned outages. So the big question, of course, is how do we plug this gap? But before we get there, we think that it's important to trace the energy crisis in South Africa over a historical period. And here we argue that there's a number of bad policy choices that resulted in the mess that Eskom is in today. When Eskom was formed in 1923, 100 years ago, it was formed as a fully public energy utility whose mandate was to, one, deliver energy as a public good, mainly to a white minority, and two, to ensure sufficient or adequate and sustainable energy supply to power up the growing or the embryonic mining industry in the country. And it played a fundamental role in the driving of the early industrialization of South Africa's economy. Fast forward to the 1980s, along with global shifts towards neoliberalism, similar trends unfolded in South Africa, where the fully public mandate of Eskom started to be unraveled. starting with its commercialization, then in 1998 losing its tax exemption, and eventually culminating in its full corporatization in 2001. And basically what this meant was that, and this, by the way, is not just Eskom, it relates to a number of other and almost all other utilities, public utilities in the country. Sometimes I get lost in the future thoughts and forget the current ones. And what happened was this public utility now has to act in the same way as a private company. And with this comes many contradictions. Included in this is the adoption of the full cost recovery model, which says that Eskom should raise its revenue or resources to finance operations, maintenance, and investment, primarily, not only, through tariffs and debt. And this, in a context where you have mass unemployment and deep levels of inequality, leads to an invariable problem in that Eskom is unable to raise the necessary resources. There was also a 1998 white paper on energy, and along with many other white papers following the introduction of the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Program in 1996, was to allow for an increased role of the private sector in the economy and a reduced role of the state, as opposed to using the state to play a more redistributive role in line with the RDP. And this 1998 white paper on energy placed a moratorium on Eskom building any new generative capacity in the hope that the private sector would come in and play a role. However, at the time, Eskom was still the #1 public energy utility in the world. It produced sufficient energy as the electrification program was still unfolding. But Eskom said to the state, in the next 6-7 years, demand will outstrip supply, to which the president at the time, Thabo Mbeki, argued against. And this is a key issue, as it then meant that new generative capacity only came on far too late and was mainly through the introduction of bad investments in the form of Medupi and Kusile. During the state capture years, we tried to give a false sense of the energy supply we have in the country, and we ran the grid excessively hard. And this creates a major problem because, one, you're not servicing the fleet or maintaining it, and then two, you're running it extra hard, which results in the breakdowns we're seeing today. So we think it's very important, in as much as we recognize corruption and a number of other factors that may contribute to the energy crisis we're seeing in the country today. We think these are the primary ones, and these are the fundamental bad policy choices that we need to reverse. Going back to the immediate question. So I said we had the 6 gigawatt energy gap. And for the past 2 years, or people were asking us, so what did government do? Surely we knew we're coming to this situation. And actually it's for the past 5 years, I would say probably, there's been a major emphasis on the hope that we would get increased private sector involvement in the energy sector. And there are primarily 2 ways within which the private sector can come on board. By the way, that's cutting the red tape. The one is through the Renewable Energy Independent Producers Procurement Program, Power Produce Thingy, the REAP, which was established in 2011. And to date, it adds less than 8% of total installed capacity. and cost more than 30% of primary energy costs, just over 5,800 megawatts of energy. There's some technical issues when it comes to renewables, not to say that it's not important to transition to it, but I want to allow Sean to deal with some of those in more detail. So in spite, or over and above, I should say, the fact that the reef only has brought on a very limited amount of energy over the past decade, it has incurred two other major challenges. The first being in relation to bid window 5. And maybe I should take a step back. I don't know how many people are familiar with how the reef model works. So it's an auction process whereby different private renewable energy producers makes a bid or a tender and says, we can produce solar PV or wind energy at such and such a price. And the idea is that the lowest bids wins what's called a tender in the form of a 20-year purchase power agreement, okay? And until thus far, there are just 91 bids that are closed. And it's important, keep this in the back of your minds, because Sean's going to deal with this auction problem, because the auction system invariably comes to the problem that we see in bid window 5, where cutthroat competition between different private renewable energy producers has resulted in the preferred bids being too low and reducing the profitability of these projects. Now, it's important to understand that most of these private renewable energy producers do not take their own capital to finance investment in these renewable energy projects. I'll just give a second for people to sit down. Instead, they turn to banks and they say to the bank, look, we've won this 20-year purchase power agreement. This is the price we want it at. We guarantee this amount of profit over 20 years. And the bank says, no, you are bankable. We will give you the resources. Because bid window 5 has become much less profitable, and even more so post rising input costs, rising fuel costs, post the pandemic, has meant that very few, if any, of the preferred bids of bid window 5 has reached financial closure. In terms of bid window 6, a different problem has arisen. In bid window 6, less than 20% of its total amount of energy that was meant to come on from this bid window can come on board given grid constraints. So what does this mean? So historically, given the way our energy is generated, primarily through coal, the grid was built around, the infrastructure was built around areas where the coal would be generated, in Mpumalanga, KZN, Limpopo, and so on. Where renewable energies are generated are in different parts of the country, Northern Cape, Eastern Cape, Western Cape. And so the wind projects that are meant to come on in the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape and Northern Cape are not able to come on because there's no longer grid capacity. So the implications of this is that neither of bid window 5 nor bid window 6's proposed 2,600 megawatts or 5,200 megawatts respectively has any chance of coming on board within the next 24 months. Okay? Even in a best case scenario where we can deal with grid capacity and the problems with the auction model. So the second way the private sector can come on board is through what's called private embedded generation. This is where companies, public and private, can generate their own electricity primarily for their own usage, but they can also sell excess supply into the grid through a feed-in tariff. Now, this requires a prerequisite for this to happen is the unbundling of Eskom and the creation of an independent transmission grid, which is called which is supposed to be called the National Transmission Corporation of South Africa. And the idea would be that the grid would have to buy electricity indiscriminately. This is implications that I'll come to in a bit. Now, there are 27 companies, primarily from what's called, or not primarily, from what's called the energy intensive users group. These are these big public and private companies who accounts for 40% of total energy consumed in the country. These are the corporations that are going to be developing private embedded generation. And they've committed 9,000 megawatts over the next 5 years, of which 1,500 megawatts is meant to come on board by the end of 2023. Should we not take any energy we can get? Well, maybe, but we think in fact there are alternative and more viable solutions that won't result in the accelerated death spiral of Eskom. What do we mean by this? So, as you see increased private electricity generation coming into the grid, especially when the transmission company has to purchase that electricity indiscriminately, there are two implications. The one is a direct one, or a direct cost to Eskom and the grid, as it would have to purchase the excess electricity from the private companies. They also have to cover the cost of what's called wheeling, the usage of the grid, and the maintenance and upgrading of the grid, which would be left to Eskom and the grid to cover. There's a bigger indirect cost, however, and that is that as more energy comes on board from private sector generators, it results in declining sales volumes and a reduction in market share. This could, I think someone said, maybe, or maybe I'm just hearing things, the spooks in my head. And as you see declining sales volumes, Eskom is invariably required to charge higher tariffs on the fewer people that can purchase energy from them. So who would be the people who would be left to purchase energy from Eskom? Well, it's the majority of impoverished people in this country who cannot go off-grid. So how do I make this simple by way of an analogy? If you normally make 10 Rand revenue, and you do that by selling sweets to 5 people, and one person drops out of your market, you're only selling to 4 people, but you still need to really make 10 Rands revenue, given in a bigger scale, you don't really reduce fixed costs and many operational costs that's required to run the energy system. And thereby shifting a greater cost onto those people who are left reliant on energy. This, coupled with bad debts taken out in foreign denominated currencies, for example, the 2010 World Bank loan for Medupi and Kusile, contributes significantly to Eskom's exponentially increasing tariffs. But maybe we should say bye-bye Eskom, as the spooks in my head said, and allow for this accelerated collapse. The problem is that Eskom currently generates 90% of the total energy installed capacity in this country. And it is based on IRP and any credible accounts, it will have to play a key role within the energy market for at least the next decade. And so if Eskom collapses, it would put the entire energy supply in even greater risk, or at even greater risk. I wanted to quickly touch on this issue of tariffs and say that in looking at it, we want to say two things. One, it's possible to scrap the tariff increase, but Eskom's financial model is unsustainable, and so doing it would result in future financial problems without addressing the Eskom's financing model, going back to this issue that it's overly reliant on raising revenue through tariffs and debts in a context where most people can't afford electricity. And this is what drives huge levels, with the rising tariff costs, huge levels of energy poverty, despite the mass electrification program that was unfolded in the 1990s. Now, when we looked at what Eskom applied to NERSA for the tariff increases, we saw that primary energy costs due to coal, increases in coal prices, and rising costs of IPPs are big drivers in the application for the tariff increase of 18.65%. And when we look at this, we're arguing that we should be capping coal prices, which has accelerated so dramatically due to increased demand for low quality coal, but also because of BEE contracts that has helped to enrich a small black elites at the expense of energy supply and the majority of people in this country. Two, the IPPs based on this auction model, the bid windows 1 to 4, we argue that we should renegotiate those prices and reduce them to reduce both the coal and the primary energy costs. We also argue that there can be reductions in the price of diesel, which I'll come to in a bit. So we're saying that we can offer these concrete proposals to scrap the tariff increase, but that ultimately would have to end the full cost recovery model. Just in terms of diesel, we've been using it excessively, but it's been helped to reduce two stages of load shedding. When we looked at the cost of diesel, we saw that Eskom hasn't been provided the license to procure diesel at wholesale prices. And so we're paying more than 6 Rand per litre for diesel than what we could be paying if Eskom was tax exempt and we scrap fuel levies, road accident fund levies, and additional taxes on the diesel price. Even more extraordinarily, a report comes out today to say that Petro SA, one state-owned enterprise, sells diesel to Eskom, another state-owned enterprise, at almost double the wholesale price of at 26 Rand per litre. Well, it varies, but debt relief. Now, Eskom has 390 billion Rand in debt, and people often lament municipalities, but municipalities owe less than 10% of Eskom's total debt, or owe less than 36 billion Rand to Eskom. The Government Employees Pension Fund, another state-owned body, statutory institution, holds more than 20% of Eskom's total liabilities. And already the PIC, the asset manager of the Government Employees Pension Fund, has offered partial relief to Eskom by allowing a 13 billion Rand rollover in debt payments. But given that the Government Employees Pension Fund is highly overfunded, it can do a lot more. It's important to note that there's a big problem with the reason, there's a big reason behind municipalities being indebted. And it's because municipalities get less than 10% of the total national revenue in what's called the division of national revenue. And so they are overly reliant on raising revenue or resources through selling tariffs, electricity, and water. And in 2019, for example, municipalities got an additional 9 billion rand in profit approximately from selling electricity. So once Eskom gets a tariff increase from NERSA, additional tariff increases can still result from municipalities. But in instances where most people can't pay, it also creates a problem for municipalities. This is also what's behind many people being removed from what's called the indigent list of who are meant to receive free basic electricity. So, is it not shared anymore? Sorry.
Sorry, we're just resharing on the Zoom board.
I don't think I'm on the Zoom anymore.
Okay.
So, maybe you can try and get me on there. So this is what highlights a big problem in the perpetuation of energy poverty in the country. So in 2003, 2004, recognizing that the corporatisation of Eskom and the adoption of full cost recovery model will have implications in relation to unaffordability for the majority of the population, compelled them to introduce free basic electricity, and they introduced it at the time, and it still remains at 50 kilowatt hours per household per month. Now, by all accounts, this is completely inadequate in that for a decent standard of living, it's estimated that we need at least 350 kilowatt hours per household per month. But it's more than that, in that out of the provision that National Treasury puts aside for households to receive free basic electricity, of which there's 11 million, less than 3 million, just over 2.5 million, actually receive free basic electricity. And this goes back to its financing model in that they are discouraged from ensuring that so-called indigent households in the current status receive it, as it would reduce how much electricity they would sell and the revenue they would receive. We think, however, that a big two issues here, and we echo the research by the Public Accountability and Research Institute, PARIB, that says that there needs to be a shift in the form of the grant from an equitable share grant that just says there's no obligation on municipalities to put this resources for free basic electricity to a conditional grant which would compel them to do so, but that it should also be made universal and that everyone should get a minimum amount of free basic electricity, after which we can implement a block tariff to start bringing back some of those revenues. So the first point we're then arguing to now, I'm going to move to what we think should be done. We first argued that we need to shift to a low carbon economy and that decarbonizing the energy sector would be a key aspect of doing so. Two, we traced the energy crisis in this country historically and pinpointed to more than 25 years of bad policy choices in the context of a global shift to neoliberalism. Three, we showed that what the current responses are meant to be or proposed to be to the energy crisis. And I think what we hope to show is that the amount of energy that's going to come on board would be inadequate to meet the needs and would in fact not come on in time to plug the immediate energy gap. And then we also try to show that Eskom would invariably incur increasing tariffs, and that the implications of the way government's proposing and the private sector's proposing we're going would actually accelerate the collapse of Eskom, jeopardizing or putting energy supply at even greater risk. So we propose that we need to take a three-step process. The first thing we argue is that we need to plug the immediate energy gap, and we make concrete proposals on how that can be done. Then we say once the energy gap is plugged, we need to look to stabilize the energy fleet. In other words, fix the fleet or stabilize energy supply. And three, we argue that lays the basis to expedite the transition through a public pathway approach to a low carbon economy. In the first instance, we're saying that we need to run the open gas cycle turbines, which we know is expensive and is not an indefinite or a long-term solution. It's already running at more than 8 times its the capacity it's meant to run at. However, it does reduce through stages of load shedding, and it can reduce a huge amount of pressure on the grid. However, we are arguing that the diesel must be provided at wholesale prices and that Treasury should be providing the resources for those diesel as opposed to pushing Eskom into greater debt. So continuing using Ankalif and Korikwa allows for 2 gigawatts, just over 2 gigawatts of energy over the short term. We argue that we need to expedite the revamping of Kuba, where Unit 1 is under revamp now, and is meant to be operational by June, and Unit 2 will then be revamped, and the revamp allows it to run safely for another 2 decades, which also brings on just under 2 gigawatts of generative capacity, dispatchable energy. Then we look to Medupi and Kusile, and we're saying that we need to fix the boiler defects. And there's boiler defects at Kusile units 1, 2, and 3, and Medupi units 4 and 5. 80% of the boiler defects was complete last year, and it's expected that the remaining 20% can be finalized before the end of the year. It's not cheap to do it, but they do show that just after improving the boiler or dealing with some of the boiler defects last year, the energy availability factor almost doubled on average between Medupi and Kusile. Whilst dealing with the boiler defects, it's also critical that we address a chimney collapse. There was a more than 220 meter tall chimney that collapsed at Kusile Unit 1, which makes Kusile Unit 1, 2, and 3 inoperable. So there is a possibility of doing a temporary solution which will take 12 months to do, as opposed to fixing the thing which will take 24 months. This is not long term, but it will allow for stabilizing the grid for longer term refurbishment and maintenance. This alone has a cost of between 6 billion and approximately 6 and 7 billion rand. We're saying together these things adds about 8.2 gigawatts of energy, and we would have to postpone or delay the decommissioning of some of the coal-fired power stations by 2 years. What this shows, however, that there's no need for an expensive car powership deal that has a major negative ecological impact, and that's probably tainted with corruption. Once we've plugged the energy gap, we think that that will allow for the stabilizing of the grid. And here we look at this, we think there's a bit of a misconception that the older the coal-fired power station, the worse it performs. When in reality, there's other challenges that many coal-fired power stations are facing, not just its age. And it's possible to improve the energy availability factor of some of them that are not that old, that have a high capacity level, but low energy availability factors. Sometimes it would also entail dealing with corruption and patronage networks in relation to some of these coal-fired power stations, like the Tuka, for example. All of this can be done over the next 2 to 4 years. There's no quick fixes, as I was saying. First, 12 to 24 months to plug the energy gap, and after that, some time to stabilize the grid. Once you've done that, we argue that Eskom must play a leading role in building new renewable energy generative capacity towards decarbonizing the electricity sector, both in order to ensure it doesn't collapse due to renewable energy private embedded generation, but also to allow for us to ensure that energy is restored as a public good and that we decommodify energy and other public services. Yeah. All of this poses a question about resources. I'm almost done, sorry. There's going to require a huge amount of resources to finance the diesel, to fix the fleet, to invest in maintenance, new generative capacity, etc. Just by the way, just a quick point, we have to allow for the expediting of procurement processes for maintenance parts, which currently there are building blocks to, and it's also critical, we argue, to insource maintenance supply. There are incentives for those who are doing maintenance to, in fact, not do good maintenance, so that they can get called back. So yes, it's going to entail quite a bit of money. Investing in the grid is going to cost 150 to 180 billion. Investing in the infrastructure for renewable energy capacity is going to cost additional huge amount of resources. We think that turning to the government employees pension fund is but one solution, where it has a surplus of 50 billion rand each year. But we think it also requires a change in South Africa's tax framework and a shift to taxing the rich. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dominique. I think that was an incredibly widespread and yet detailed overview of where we've come from and where we need to go. Just to say briefly, apologies to those on Zoom. We lost the Zoom connection for Dominique at some point, and so you lost his slides. But I'm sure I'm speaking on Dominique's behalf when I say that he will make his slides available.
Never.
Never, okay. No, he'll make his slides available so you can catch up, and hopefully you were able to listen to them. I think Dominique kind of set out very clearly and very thoroughly the way that decisions made at particular points in history reverberate and have implications way into the future. So the kind of decisions made around privatization, adopting neoliberal policies, not doing, the maintenance when it should have been done, not generating new circuits, not building new build, all of those that were decisions made quite long ago have resulted in the problem that we face now. And I think that really framed for me what he said about the decisions we have to make now, so that we, in 10 years' time, are not sitting in the same room, still facing load shedding. And I think Dominique set out very clearly the kind of possibles and alternatives that he's arguing are the decisions we need to make now to avoid, to solve the problem that we're facing now. I'm going to hand over to Sean, and he can kind of give a more of an international perspective and framing around the issues around public energy. Sean Sweeney is the coordinator of the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. So let me hand over to Sean. Thanks.
Thanks, Amber. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. And thanks everybody for coming out and being part of this important discussion. Thanks, Dominic, for an excellent assessment of the current situation and what we need to do about it. I'm going to take a look through a broader lens, a more global picture, and really to emphasize a few points. The first point is that the energy transition that is being pushed as a sort of a green growth capitalist model is actually politically and economically in real trouble. And the reason why it's important to emphasize that point is because when you look at the South African media, it's as if South Africa is trailing behind everybody else. Everybody else is getting off with coal, but South Africa, because it's got this monster dinosaur utility called Eskom, is basically behind. And there's dangers in being left behind. And this has been the narrative coming from the government, from some of the think tanks, and so on. I don't think that is true. I think it's a global crisis of the energy system. And public utilities all over the world are faced with similar challenges because they've been undermined by neoliberal market policy, and they are unable to play a leading role in the energy transition. And I'll go into more detail on that later. I also want to, if there's time, talk about the alternative, because we can complain until we're blue in the face, or green in the face if you like, but it won't make any difference unless we've got something we can organize around, we've got our facts straight, and we've got our arguments clear. So I want to start with the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, which is a project that's now 10 years old. It has over 90 unions in the network. It's particularly strong in the global south these days. More unions are joining from developing countries. In the last 3 months, 6 national trade union centers from sub-Saharan Africa have joined, and we've had recruits from Chile, from Colombia, and elsewhere. Now, what our analysis that has been developed over 10 years is what we're witnessing in the world today is not an energy transition, but an energy expansion. In other words, there's a growing use of energy of all types: wind, solar, yes, also coal, oil, and gas. So what we're seeing is an increase in all because the energy demand is rising on an annual basis. Every year for the last 80 years, really, without too much by way of interruption, has been the same. What this shows is that emissions continue to rise, so the climate policy is not effective. So the green growth model, which relied on the private sector, is failing. It's failing on multiple levels. And we need, the third point, an alternative approach. Now, some of the things we propose in the public pathway may sound like mission impossible. But when we look at the climate emergency and we think that we can solve that problem without radical transformative measures and policies, we are living in basically a bubble, a naive dreamland, which is where I can say most of the world's leaders are when they talk about climate change. Tears roll down the cheeks. They talk about our planet is in danger, and then they carry on as though nothing has happened. And I can point to numerous examples of that. I'll just refer to one, which is in my head at the moment. The head of the United Nations Environment Program, Ingvar Anderson, said that the time for small changes and incremental changes is no longer here, that we must have basically a complete transformation of the global political economy in order to address the climate change. And he says, we're urging people to listen to the proposals in our report. The report is called the Emissions Gap Report 2022. So please take a look at it, because what does she suggest would be the solution? She said every private investor should invest in zero carbon solutions. And that raises a very fundamental problem. It's like, what if you can't make any money out of zero carbon solutions? And this, I think, is the fundamental problem of the neoliberal approach. Is they said it was going to be a massive money-making operation, and it's turned out not to be that way. And that means investment is not being produced in order to make the transition possible. Now my screen is frozen. I'm trying to move my slides, so I might need a bit of help here. Can I get, sorry, Jack.
And apply
So this is the Zoom. Oh, okay, so it's that one.
Sound is very bad now. This one.
Okay, so sounds not very good. Any better out there in the world? Those of you who are listening from the 5 continents?
Just spoke to my head again.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so just a couple of words on the public pathway. It's a work in progress. We're looking for non-profit, planned approach to the energy transition where all technologies are on the table, adequately publicly financed through a global Green New Deal or similar change in the multilateral system. Now, a lot of the things I'm going to say are elaborated in more detail in this document called Towards a Public Pathway Approach to a Just Energy Transition to the Global South. So if we can make that document available, it's in second draft form, and the final draft will come out in the next couple of months. Now, energy expansion, not transition.
Sorry, there just seems to be an issue with the microphone. Would you mind, maybe not that microphone?
Not this one?
Mind just unmuting your laptop and then we'll mute the house mic.
I'm not sure how we mute it. Is that it?
No, not that.
Okay.
Speak now.
All right. Should we continue? Okay. So let's have a look. This idea that South Africa must get off of coal because it's burning the planet on its own. First of all, it's true. South Africa should get off of coal, but so should the rest of the world. That's a planned proposition. It needs to be done over a period of decades. It's not going to happen in 5 minutes. And any idea that South Africa, by cutting its coal dramatically, will change the political economy of energy at the global level is a mistake. This doesn't mean to say we just are dismissive of climate concerns. Quite the contrary. The climate emergency is probably the biggest challenge facing human civilization. It's something that has to be addressed, and private markets and private investment are not capable of doing that. So we do need a planned transition away from fossil fuels, including managed decline of fossil fuel use. But it can't be done on the basis of market forces. So here's a chart that shows, I hope everybody can see it now, global coal use. And you'll see that there's no significant move away from coal. The 2 dips you see in that chart was due, first of all, to the recession in China around about 2015. China consumes half of the world's coal. India, a quarter of the world's coal. So because of what happened in China with the recession, there was less coal use. And a lot of policymakers said, oh, look, the world is moving away from coal. Look, in China, it's going down. But it had nothing to do with renewable energy or climate policy. It was all to do with the recession. China's economy is very coal dependent. And the second, of course, was 2 years ago with COVID-19, where there was basically a very serious slowdown in economic activity, which meant that not only did emissions go down, but coal use went down as well. But essentially, the trajectory for coal is not downwards significantly, and it could increase. In fact, coal use in 2022 was at record levels globally. It's more than doubled since 1970, and that is an astonishing statistic in an era of climate change. Now, let's have a look at the kind of the trajectory. This is kind of, you'll see the red line is current trends. That's where the direction is going. And then you see various scenarios based on energy efficiency, renewable energy, carbon capture, nuclear power, that shows the trajectory that needs to happen in order to be consistent with climate targets. But the important is the first part of that chart, which is showing that emissions are rising when they need to be falling. And that is going to continue unless there is a radical change in policy away from the current market approach. So you see contradictory headlines. I'm sure comrades have seen this before. What is the true story? You get headlines that says renewable power posted its biggest ever increase in 2021. If you read that in isolation, you would think well, things are going according to plan. Maybe the policies are working after all, and maybe we should do more of those policies. And then you get that the world's emissions from the world's power plants reach their highest ever level. In other words, this is an energy expansion, not an energy transition. Yes, renewables are growing very quickly, but so too are other forms of energy, fossil fuels, nuclear power, etc., particularly fossil fuels. In fact, 3/4 of all new energy demand in the world today every year is met by fossil fuels. And the leading sources of new fossil fuels use is the Asia-Pacific region. Now, this should also put the sort of the state of renewable energy in the context of all energy consumption. You can see there, wind and solar are barely visible on the map. This is not a good thing. This is a bad thing. Hydro is relatively stagnant, and the rest is fossil-based or nuclear energy. So you can see that the energy use is expanding, and the other forms of energy are growing alongside it, but very, very low levels at this stage. Now let's turn to the policy. You know, this climate policy, the policy that exists today, was developed in the early 1990s, when the world came together in the form of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Earth Summit of 1992, the first Earth Summit, where they said the world is in danger, we need to do something about it. And neoliberal policymakers, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, all the think tanks, pro-business, corporations, all of those people said, no, we don't worry about this. We have a solution to this crisis. It's a serious crisis, but there's a lot of money to be made. And what we need to do is mobilize the private sector to invest in green economy, low carbon solutions. Significantly, governments need not intervene with a heavy hand. All they needed to do was provide a carrot in the form of incentives, subsidies, various grants for clean energy, particularly renewable energy, and a stick. And the stick in this instance is carbon pricing. Put a price on the pollution, the argument goes, you create a market then for pollution, and then people can trade their right to pollute, but the incentive will be to get away from carbon dioxide and other forms of greenhouse gases. This is what they call the sticks and carrots approach. The stick is the incentive. Sorry, the stick is the disincentive, the carrots are the incentive. Now, let's have a look, first of all, at the stick, the state and trends of carbon pricing. This is 3 years old now, but it's not changed significantly. You can see the blue is unpriced carbon dioxide. Now, bear in mind, in 2005, the World Bank and the neoliberal institutions were saying that carbon would be priced globally by 2020. Well, you can see how far they've got, not very far, about 15, maybe 18% now is priced. But equally significant is the price that has been put on carbon dioxide in some of the more developed economies is so low, it has absolutely no effect on investment levels and emissions. So this is a failed policy, and it's been 20 years of failure, but still, you'll hear in Davos last week, where the World Economic Forum met, they were talking about the need for a global carbon price. This is like hand waving. If they think we're living in a fantasy world, they should look at their own fantasies, because they are in charge and they have nothing to show for their attempt to put a price on pollution. Furthermore, it is a policy that provokes resistance. I've got many slides on this, but this is the yellow vests in France 4 years ago, who rebelled against the increase on diesel fuel because it was argued by the government increasing the price of fuel would reduce its use. Well, that's not true if you're a taxi driver, a truck driver, and you're responsible for your own to purchase to keep your job, essentially, or if you have to drive for a living or just drive to get to work. This is so ironic. The neoliberal policy privatized public transport systems all over the global south, has wrecked public transport systems, and now they want to impose a charge on drivers who need to work, drive for a living. Workers are not stupid. They knew
they knew that the price would go on the diesel fuel, they would pay the price, but the carbon would end up in the atmosphere anyway. So it was a lose-lose situation, no environmental benefits. Now, I can hear, I'm sure some people are thinking, well, isn't renewables cheaper now? Isn't the big narrative in South Africa is that it's so cheap because you don't have to pay any price for wind and any price for sun. So it's got to be good, right? It's going to be better than coal. That's the argument. And of course, renewables are better than coal, but cheap renewables does not fit in with the green growth model. So here's a quote from just a few weeks ago, and actually this is about 6 months ago. We're all in trouble. Wind turbine makers selling at a loss and in a self-destructive loop, bosses admit. Now, what's going on here? If it's cheap, why are they in trouble? Why are they facing bankruptcy? It's not just wind, it's also solar. It's because the current system of deploying renewable energy, as Dominic suggested, is companies have to bid for the right to generate power in an auction system. So they bid against each other. They bid against each other in order to secure a power purchase agreement with a utility, in this case, Eskom, but in other parts of the world, obviously the utilities have different names, but they basically have to are based on that. They have to win. The winner does very well. The losers don't do well. So there's this hustling around to try to win the contracts, which is completely out of sync with any planned and orderly approach to an energy transition. So we see profit levels in the renewable sector very low, and therefore the investment levels are low because the private investors don't want to finance a project that isn't going to make them money. It's as simple as that. It's simple capitalist thinking and economics. Here's a recent chart I saw. This comes from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, just came out a few days ago. The black line is coal profits, and the red line is renewable energy profits, solar in this instance. So you can see that actually it's all clean energy. So you can see now, renewables may be cheaper, but the profit margins are not there to attract the investment. And this is the fundamental problem of the capitalist approach to energy transition. This chart shows the investment gap. It's been estimated that what the world needs is somewhere between 1.6 trillion and 3.8 trillion annually in investment in low carbon solutions. And this is where the investment numbers are at the bottom, around about 600 billion. Now, of course, the headline will say investment has doubled in the last 5 years. Well, it's true, but look at the investment that's needed, and we see that it's way, way behind what is required and still trailing the investment in fossil-based development. Now, what about the Just Energy Transition Partnership? South Africa has been in the news lately for the last year and a half, really. There's been, or a year and a quarter, since the COP26 in Glasgow at the end of 2021, there was an announcement of the Just Energy Transition Partnership between the UK, the European Union, the US, and it was to dangle concessionary finance, or some call it concessional finance, which would basically allow South Africa to accelerate its transition away from coal. This was depicted as a great breakthrough. Now, the basic idea of this form of finance is that the 8.5 billion that was put on the table is mostly in loans, not in a grant. So in other words, it incurs more debt for South Africa. It's a cheap loan, yes, but the idea is it's supposed to catalyze, this is the favorite word, or mobilize private investment. Now, there is absolutely no empirical or factual basis that says $8.5 billion of public development bank money will mobilize any money from the private sector. There's nothing to say that it would do that. In fact, it's counterintuitive, because if the public sector, if the public banks are putting up money, then the only conditions that would attract private enterprises if they can make returns on their investment. And 8.5 billion in the context of South Africa's relatively developed economy is not a lot of money. So it's not going to make much difference. Now, the terms in the Just Energy Transition Partnership are worth looking into. We have argued in SHUED and AIDC that this is green structural adjustment. It's using the promise, if you like, of concessional finance to be contingent on, this is quoting from the document now, catalytic public sector finance. In other words, public money has to be put up first before the private sector responds. There needs to be the creation of an enabling environment. This is a term that's been around for 40 years now. And that means the private sector to the independent power producers must be encouraged and subsidized in order to participate. And that investment needs to be de-risked. And that means removing regulatory barriers. What does de-risking mean? It essentially says, if I put money in, you've got to guarantee I get money out to it at a percentage of profit that's going to satisfy shareholders and investors and cover costs, not just our costs, but the additional costs of competition, of profit, and so on, and repaying for borrowed money. So this is basically, the deal is privatization in the name of climate protection. And that's what we're up against, and that's what we're resisting. I want to draw your attention to this report. This is the Overseas Development Institute in the UK. They did an analysis of blended finance. Was it basically blending public and private? Was the public mobilizing, as the World Bank says, billions of public money into trillions of private investment? And the answer is an emphatic no. Basically, the analysis showed that there needs to be a reality check in terms of the amount of money that is mobilized by the private sector. All across now, the elite institutions, you'll see growing frustration with the private sector not responding to the carrots. And this is what is the heart of neoliberal energy policy and its crisis. It's the problem that they cannot move the capital. The head of the United Nations Development Program, Achim Steiner, said last year, the big financial interests are a liability to us all. They are sitting on $300 trillion in assets, and they are not investing in the green economy and a zero carbon future. So these are cracks, comrades. These are cracks in the model that has been put forward now for 30 years and is being repeated day after day in the South African media as the only alternative to load shedding and the crisis of Eskom. Now, let me try to move towards what I think is a more hopeful scenario. This picture I took in Johannesburg in 2012, 10.5 years ago, at NUMSA, when NUMSA convened a conference on renewable energy and social ownership of renewables. The progress on that front has been very limited because of the crisis in the South African trade union movement, but the ideas of that conference and similar ideas have spread since then, and not just in South Africa. This is the Trade Unions Development Platform of the Americas, which is all of the union federations in the Americas supported the idea of reclaiming energy to public ownership. This is the Korean trade union movement, has been talking about now a public transition, publicness, where the energy system that has been marketized and privatized be returned to public hands in order to drive the energy transition. Public Services International has become increasingly visible, and they represent how many million workers, Sandra? 35 or something? 35 million workers in the public services are calling for and arguing for taking public services back in-house, including energy. This didn't end very happily, but the Labour Party in Britain under Jeremy Corbyn called for and committed to renationalize energy. It was privatized in the 1980s and early 1990s under the Thatcher government. And now we see more recently in France, the French unions have fought off efforts to privatize and break up the national utility EDF. Incidentally, EDF operates as a multinational outside of France, but inside France, it's a publicly owned utility. At COP26 in Glasgow, on the same day as the Just Energy Transition Partnership with South Africa was announced, there was the launch of the trade union program for a public low carbon energy future, which has got the endorsement of many unions. And it's not a list of demands. It's a set of proposals to repeal neoliberal reforms and to return energy to public ownership, but with a new mandate. And that mandate must be a planned transition to low carbon future. Now, I think Eskom Transformed, if the comrades haven't had a chance to read it, is a very good document in that it explains the role, the potential role of a well-resourced, modern, transparent, not corrupt public utility can be in the energy transition. The simple premise, among the simple premises, is that the decommodification of electricity is crucial. Because if people make money, whether they're private or public, by selling electricity, there is an incentive to sell more of it, and therefore less of an incentive to conserve energy. So the model we must put forward with the public pathway is how do we use today's knowledge and technologies and skills to reduce unnecessary energy consumption while meeting basic energy needs. That is a problem and a challenge for planning, that a reclaimed utility, whether it be Eskom or any other public utility, that is the essential task of a public utility. It can drive renewable energy from coal through what we call a direct procurement program. At the moment, the model is we don't buy the technologies, we buy the power from basically multinationals outside of South Africa. So a few more quick points. Comrades, this system is falling apart. So the trade unions have been putting forward, not all trade unions, I hasten to add, have been putting forward a different policy, and it is beginning to resonate in the social movement. But what we can see now is the beginnings of the unraveling of the policy at the highest level. This is from Vietnam, which was praised just a couple of years ago for having the fastest growing renewable energy program. It's now moving towards cancelling its renewable energy program because it hasn't got the grid capacity to keep up with the new solar and wind installations. This is basically the ratings agency, Fitch Ratings, saying state-owned enterprises are key to the energy transition. Now, you wouldn't have seen that headline a few years ago. That's because they failed with the other model, which is to mobilize the private sector, and now they're looking back at state-owned enterprises, which still represent a lot of the world's energy production and transmission as a key to the solution to climate change. Governments are renationalizing their electricity utilities. This is the case of Uganda. This was just a month ago or 2 months ago. You can see they're beginning to reclaim their energy system. Small country, Honduras, you'll see there. This is a quote from a business magazine, which is very concerned about what's going on there. The government's proposed reform would be a setback and further consolidate the state's power. Of course, that's exactly what we want. We want to consolidate the state's power, and the Honduran government are basically renegotiating and cancelling the contracts with independent power producers. Ghana decided a few years ago it would rather pay compensation to the independent power producers than honor the contracts to 2030 to 2032. They paid $430 million in US dollars in compensation to the independent power producers, which are multinationals, but they saved $1.4 billion by not honoring the contracts. This, I think, is the most interesting example. This is the Mexican government, a left-wing government, came to power 3 years ago and has canceled the renewable energy contracts with the independent power producers. And that letter there is from the US State Department saying, if you carry on the way you're going, you're going to be in big trouble with us, because you are violating the terms of the free trade agreement between Mexico, the US, and Canada. The head of the government, the president of Mexico, has said, well, I'm afraid energy sovereignty is not negotiable. We're going to do what we want. We have compromised our national grid to the point where we can no longer provide reliable power, and we are not providing renewable energy. So this is the largest renewable energy project in Latin America. 400 megawatts of solar power, a public partnership between the government of Mexico and the state of Sonora in Mexico. This is a publicly driven direct procurement model of energy. There is an alternative to the private pathway. It's the public pathway. We got to drill down on it, and we got to work on it and stay abreast of the changes that need to happen. So I've gone over time, so I'm going to stop there. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sean. I think you set out very clearly and gave context to the kind of what was behind Dominic's arguments around the decision that we have to make now. And I think you made it very clear that we can't make decisions which perpetuate the neoliberal model, which perpetuates a market solution to energy generation and distribution. I want to open up for discussion now. What I would suggest is that I give the room, anybody in the room who wants to speak, an opportunity, maybe up to 4 or 5 people in the room. And then we go over to the Zoom and 4 or 5 people who might want to raise questions from the Zoom. And then let's go from that. So an opportunity to ask questions and make comments. And then I think at the end, you know, before we close, we want to try and work, you know, a way forward, a kind of a direction we can move in. So let me open up. Are there any immediate hands up that anybody wants to raise? Any
disagreements?
Or disagreements? Disagreements, welcome to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also,
Do we need? Are you gonna? Okay.
Hi, my name is Worsen. I apologize in advance. I'm going to leave in about less than 10 minutes. Else I'm going to miss the last bus. I'm not running out. Thank you. That was extremely informative. Thank you for stressing me the point that these are not finance instruments. They're loans, they're straight up foreign loans, for example. The one thing that's missing, in my view, from discussions like this is we're talking extensively about the supply side of it. How do we reduce the production of dirty energy? But we're not talking about reducing demand, reducing consumption. Now, we're sitting in a world where we've got to uplift, I don't know, 3 billion, 4 billion people out of life-threatening poverty, but the other half, other quarter, however many, of the world population is literally consuming the planet into destruction. So my question would be to you, how do we, while we're making sure there's enough energy for the people who really need it, reduce that out of control consumption? Thank you.
Anybody else? Any other people in the physical room got your hands up? Otherwise, we can maybe take. Have you got anybody who's got their hand up there? Richard, okay. Can he speak? I mean, can Richard? Okay, go for it. I'm handing over to Richard.
While we put Richard too.
Richard Worthington. Thanks. Can you unmute?
Hi, sorry, I thought you were taking the room first. Can you hear me?
You are the next person. Yes, we can hear you. We can.
Okay, I was just going to ask if anyone would attempt to propose how we can delimit or circumscribe any role for a market in electricity supply so that we ensure that commercial and industrial electricity users actually pay the full costs of getting supply, possibly a return to the suppliers as well, if local government is still required to raise revenue that way. And also to ensure that people don't use electricity wastefully. In other words, do you see any role for a market in encouraging efficient use of electricity? Thanks.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks for that question. If there are no, anybody else?
Yeah, there's a few, but no one's got their hand up.
Okay. Well, maybe I should then give the two speakers an opportunity to address those two questions, particularly since I think Vincent is leaving soon. So maybe it would be good to deal with those. Do either of you want to start, Dominic? So it's the two questions about dealing with demand.
So here's one from Martin Kagwa.
Okay, so a question to Sean. Sorry, let me use my mic. A question to Sean. How feasible is a public pathway for energy transition when the state is weak, poor, or under capture by private capitalists? And then, okay, there's a long question coming. Okay, look, I'm going to stop at those three, and then there is another question, but I think I'm going to deal with the next two questions that are coming once these questions have been answered. So maybe let's deal with those three questions for now, and then we can come back.
Can I take the last question first on the
sure.
weak state?
Yeah.
Look, it's obvious to, I think, most people here that for 40 years, public services and public assets have been under attack. And rebuilding those assets and the power of states to do the right thing in terms of energy transition is not a 5-minute proposition. It's going to take years. Skills development, of training, of rebuilding a culture, a public service, that has largely been decimated, criminally destroyed by neoliberal policy. Margaret Thatcher, who said, there's no such thing as society, there are only individuals. And that is the consequences of that thinking is everybody's out for themselves has basically led us into this ditch. Now, getting out of the ditch is going to require, first of all, let's look at the global realities. At the moment, hundreds of billions, trillions of public money is being used to make profitable what would not otherwise be profitable, and that is renewable energy and clean tech solutions. Those industries are basically taking advantage of the climate emergency. They're making money out of it, but the money is going straight into the pockets of private investors. And some environmentalists will say, well, that's getting the job done, isn't it? We can't, it's not a perfect world and we've got to make compromises. Why can't development finance and investment be used to rebuild state assets? Why can't we take advantage of public financing where the borrowing, even debt financing, is cheaper because of lower interest rates for public institutions? Why are we subsidizing the rich? Why are we doing that? Now, we can win that argument, but the policies then have to be, and in the short term, I think this is feasible. There needs to be a change. Instead of undermining public utilities so they cannot operate, they can't do anything, public finance, World Bank finance, development loans, adequate levels of taxation domestically in order to fuel, to allow for this reinvestment, can be used to rebuild the public services. Focusing on energy, that is going to be absolutely essential if we're going to plan our way out of this. So it's not an easy thing. And I'm going to have to dominate, but it is possible, I think, if there's a shift at the global level. I'll remind comrades, and most of you may not need reminding. In the sort of late 70s, mid to late 70s, the idea that electricity should, or any public service should be privatized was completely off radar. It was not even discussed, except amongst the free market think tanks. And it was only after the coup in Chile, significantly, when the Chicago boys came in and talked about structural adjustment. And it became a contagion, a policy contagion, all around the world, privatization. Now we're paying the price, but it would only take
one or two key governments to change the policy, and we will see another contagion back in the other direction, because the situation is ripe for a big, massive change in policy. It won't be easy, but it is doable.
So I just want to just quickly add to what you were saying, and I think some of these policy things that can be done, like insourcing of manufacturing, insourcing of procurement, a number of other factors that can help to rebuild state capacity. And the financing question is fundamental to that, and where the resources is going to be found. I think going to the issue of demand is lots of merit in looking at the issue of reducing excessive demand. I think we prioritize looking at where we can bring on large levels of generative capacity, because even when you look at, based on government's reports, when looking at demand, there's not much that can really be reduced. However, there are views, and one example is made by Neil Coleman, who is calling for a closure, at least I think a temporary one, of the aluminium smelters like South 32, which consumes 5% of total energy consumed in the country. And so to close down that smelter whilst, as Neil would argue, implementing the necessary social protections for workers could be a means of looking at demand. And I think, many houses are running pools and all sorts of fancy equipment that would definitely reduce their level of energy consumed. And I think in that regard, maybe I would say government regulation has a bigger role to play than the market, just in a quick response to Richard.
Great, thanks. I think there've been quite a few chats or comments in the chat and the Q&A. I think Dominic has alluded to one already that Neil Coleman made about declaring force majeure on aluminium smelter contracts as a way of dealing with some of the demand issues. I think Bruce has raised has kind of made a long comment in the chat, but I think it comes down to the political will. Is there political will in the country to actually deal with this issue, which I think was partly covered, but maybe that's almost a question that we need to move into, is given the current context, the political context that we're in, what are our options around the way forward? How do we, if there is no political will from the side of the state, what is our solution? What is our way forward? Sonny has also made a comment about that if the debt to the World Bank was cancelled, would that not free up a lot of finances? And I don't know if Dominic wants to comment on that. And then Sonny has also made a comment about how can we encourage socially owned renewable energy in the absence of the state, of financial support from the state. So I think it has to do with, if a lot of these questions, a lot of the comments are around, if the state is not currently coming up with solutions outside of a neoliberal framework, then what for us is the way forward? How do we move forward? Perhaps I can summarize a lot of the comments and questions in that frame. Oh, sorry, and I do see Duma has got his hand up. So let's take from Duma quickly. So I'm gonna switch off this mic. Okay, Duma, you can open.
There's more in the room, because I think we can.
Yeah, so let's let Duma speak, and then we can open up the room again and then see how we move forward.
Okay, thank you very much for excellent presentations. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, very well.
Okay, I'm not sure where to start. Just a few comments on the present. Okay, I'll just start at the top. I thought Eskom Transformed was so let me start again. I think what is happening at Eskom is the most important issue in South Africa right now. I can't emphasize how important it is. I don't have the language to do it, yeah. So now, secondly, I would say that Eskom Transformed was an excellent report, but we didn't take the same ideas and put it into the South African case study. I didn't think we have presented a compelling argument to prove in the South African context the things that Sean is talking about. We haven't looked into the economics of the independent power market. There was a wobble in the market recently because of Ukraine and so forth, but we haven't looked into those issues. We haven't looked into the financing. So there are many things that I believe that we haven't done to build a compelling case for public ownership. And then just quickly, on maintenance, I think it's the biggest myth in South Africa today that we haven't spent on maintenance. Consistently, I've looked at all the annual reports over the past 15 years. We spent about 8% of revenues on maintenance. And the maintenance has increased currently under this new regime of Andre de Ruyter. And in terms of the plant maintenance ratio as well, it has been pretty where it should be. So what has happened is, and then finally, if you look at the technical statistics, the plants weren't run too hard. I won't go into the detail. That is just Eskom propaganda, number one. Number two, and then just a little comment on the BEE. The BEE a few years ago in coal was about 70% established companies. So there's been now, since 2018, Anglo-American and South 32 have sold to a company called Seriti, which is now the biggest supplier. So they've just inherited the old contracts. So the coal has consolidated around two companies, Seriti and Exxaro, with about 70% of production. So these are so that is what the situation is in coal. And then lastly, I just want to say, in terms of a vision for the future, I would say we cannot have a budget constraint with Eskom. So firstly, we have to take 75% of the debt off the balance sheet. Number two, we must write off all the municipal debt, 50 billion rands, and give the money over to Eskom and find another way of financing the municipalities. As Dominic said, I was looking to City of Joburg, the most supposedly wealthiest municipality. They don't have the revenues to address the infrastructure backlog in Johannesburg, which is now a slum. So the whole funding model in DORA is a problem which we must look into. So I think we should ring fence the legacy assets into Eskom 1, and then Eskom 2 must be, so we must pay for the diesel, we must pay for the maintenance, whatever it takes to fix Eskom. And then Eskom 2 must be the new capacity renewables. So I do believe that there must be a permanent line item in the budget to finance the new capacity. Top of my head, it's about 2.5% of GDP every year until 2030 to make reality of those figures that Dominic is talking about, the 1.2 trillion. So it works out roughly 2.5% of GDP every year. And then finally, the free basic education, free basic electricity must be expanded. And then finally, there has to be a freeze on electricity prices. You saw it in Europe with price caps. I was just doing a quick calculation, 900% increase in electricity prices. And if the government is really serious about inflation, they should freeze these price increases at about, I would say freeze it at 0 for 3 years, and they must pay the difference with whatever necessary, the 18%. Yeah. So these are things, energy prices are unaffordable, or the alternative, they can freeze them at the inflation rates of 4.5%, and then they pay the difference between the 4.5% and the 18% and the 12%. Yeah. So the government must take those measures, fiscal policy measures, to control the electricity prices. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for some very important points there, I think, particularly around financing. Yeah. Any other comments from the room, from anybody in the room? Any more comments? Otherwise, I can give to Sean and Dominic to make any points on any of the, Brian.
Thanks. Like everybody else, it's to appreciate the inputs as well as the comments that people have made in the chat. What I want us to do is perhaps bring this discussion down to a level that we can mobilize people around. Because it's very high power, this discussion, very technical at some levels. We've had inputs that have provided us with a huge amount of information in a very short space of time to absorb.
I can't hear, I think they need this.
So I think there are three basic issues that we have to confront. The most immediate issue, which is worrying all of us, is the impact of load shedding. And everybody is asking, what can be the solution to load shedding? And the first point I think that needs to be emphasized, which Dominic made, was that there is no quick solution. There is no quick solution. The second issue that we need to be ask ourselves, and this points to some of the inputs that Sean has made, is the private sector the knight on the white horse? You know, is it going to come to the rescue? And I think the point that needs to be emphasized is that the private sector entering the electricity sector means that we are commodifying electricity more than we have done, and we are making it an issue of profit, right? So what happens to the millions of people that are load shedded, not by Eskom turning off the plugs, but because they are so damn impoverished because of mass unemployment in this country? So the private sector entering the electricity and us creating an electricity market where private firms are going to not only generate electricity, because I was reading an interesting report now about how they want to get involved in upgrading the transmission line. So the transmission system will also partially be privatized. The moment that comes in, the tariffs have to go up in order to guarantee profit. And the amount of workers that will be left in the industry will be at a minimum in order to ensure the profitability of the private sector. So comrades, the load shedding issue is also a cover through which the privatization of the electricity sector is being promoted. Because it's only the private sector that can sort out the problem. And what we're trying to argue is that actually it's the public, it's fixing Eskom is the first thing we need to do to sort out load shedding. As Dominic explained, we've got a huge capacity to generate electricity, but it's broken. Fix the damn things. That's what we must do. And we must throw money at fixing it. We must use the extensive budget of this government to fix it. The second issue is in relation to the question of climate change and the climate crisis that we have. And again, I think Sean has pointed out that the attempt to resolve the climate crisis through incentivizing the private sector to come and decarbonize has failed, and it's failed for the last 30 odd years, since Rio 92, what was it?
The Earth Summit,
yeah.
1992.
But the point is that here we are being sold an idea that there is a just transition that we are getting money for that is going to help us create a shift from this polluting economy that we've got to a clean economy. And that's an absolute myth. It is being done in order to again promote the entry of the private sector
into the electricity market through not building new coal-fired power plants, but through building renewable energy. So we are going to be conscientized that actually the private sector is the good players because they want to provide clean energy and get us out of the mess that we are in. But what are we trying to demonstrate is that the private sector has no interest unless it can make money in upgrading the grid, upgrading the transmission lines in order to bring the renewable energy which is stuck in the Northern Cape and the Western Cape up to Gauteng and Mpumalanga and where it's needed. That is going to require billions of state funds. So why do we make the opening for the private sector in the first place when we are going to do what neoliberalism has done for 20, 30 years, is to subsidize the private sector and socialize the risks that come with it. That is what is at the essence of the independent power purchase programs, and is what is driving the entry of the private sector. My third issue is none of our proposals can work. None of what we are suggesting can work unless we make a break with the dominant policies that we've got in this country. Brings me back to the first point that I'm making. There's no quick solution, and we've got to organize and mobilize and understand what is at stake, because if we don't do that, we are going to entrench a set of policies that is going to worsen unemployment, deepen inequality, and ensure that mass unemployment and all the rubbish that goes with it, all the social crises, will deepen and continue. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Might be a little bit of a shift, but I think Brian's point allows me to segue slightly. So I think this information is really critical and has to be made accessible to the majority of people. Otherwise, it's literally preaching and debating in a small group, and it has no impact on many of us who want to understand and be part of something to solve an energy crisis, but also for many people who don't have access to electricity, period. And that also needs to be resolved in trying to solve the problems of Eskom and loadshedding. It moves me to renewable energy and the just energy transition. I think there has to be also a discussion, an accessible one, around what the just energy transition plan means for South Africa. What is the 15.8 billion? What is it? And there was a comrade commenting in the chat that it's tantamount to loans, which is going to put us further into debt. And I just want to give an example of what is happening in the Northern Cape. So it is seen as a place that is going to solve a lot of the energy or energy transition problems of this country and produce a lot of money for South Africa. So it's targeted especially for green hydrogen, for renewable energy like solar and wind. And for example, 240,000 hectares of communal land, so community-owned land, is being set aside to have these solar and wind plants. The solar and wind is subsidized by the state. So these are going to be gazetted as part of the strategic infrastructure plans of the South African government. Patricia Lil announced this at the end of last year at the Green Hydrogen Summit, which means our South African taxes and money goes to, as comrades have spoken about before, support, or the English word of what I'm trying to say has lost me, but incentivize or whatever private companies, whether it be Sasol or others, right? And just to show how little care they have for communities, if 240 or 186,000 hectares of communal land of the Richtersveld community, which is a community that has fought for their communal land, it is the first land restitution case in South Africa. The Northern Cape Economic Development Agency, along with the state, is offering communities R3 a hectare for land to produce solar and wind. And we can only imagine what that means in terms of the profit that these companies are going to generate, but also the cost that this type of renewable energy is going to cost. Never mind that most of this is set aside for export. So it's also showing the priority of the government. All of these master plans that they are developing are not to solve our immediate energy crisis. It's to facilitate the energy transition of the global north and leave us to sit amongst ourselves discussing how to solve Eskom. And so that also leaves me lastly with, how do we take this information to our communities to build a campaign around, so not only, so firstly, it's load shedding, and people need to understand why fix or save Eskom, because most people will say, why should we, given that the state is so corrupt and this and that. So how do we justify this and organize and rebuild things on the ground? Thanks.
I'm conscious that it is after 7 now, so I hope people don't mind if we are carrying on a little bit over time, just so that we can make sure that we're exhausting the discussion this evening, certainly. I don't know if there are any more hands in the room, or whether I can ask Sean and Dominique to make perhaps some concluding remarks. Because I am conscious that people might be needing to leave.
Maybe if I may chip in before they make their concluding remarks.
Sure.
I'm just checking with us here in the house, plus Sean and Dominique, on what should be the position currently, as we've been back and forth up until stages 6, and now they've been saying in the media, in order to stop us going extreme to stage 8 and whatever stages, the best way is to, what do they call it, put a call for a state of disaster. And I'm wondering what would that mean in terms of resolving the current crisis, because I know the impact is being felt, the economic impact of load shedding and the Eskom crisis is being felt by most of us. Education sector, health sector, I really don't understand why would a tertiary hospital, be it a secondary, be load shed when a key operational, processes and programs should be happening there. And like Brian was saying, comrades will tell you that, what they hear when there's load shedding is the smell of a sewer on the road, and the pothole that keeps that sewer smell or worsens it. And yeah, all of that, all those problems. So what should be the position, or what does the state of what disaster mean? Will that be a solution to the current problem? Sure.
All right. So I'm going to give Maybe Brian and Sean Dominique and Sean to make some final points. Who wants to start? Sean, do you want to start? And then Dominique can try and lay a way forward.
Thanks. I'll be brief and make the comments very patient. Look, I mean, what Brian said in his intervention and others, energy and energy transition questions are inevitably technical. And for many years in the left, and I'm old enough to remember when energy wasn't ever discussed on any level. It was just like, it was just there. You stick the plug in, you turn the light on, and no one even knew where it came from. And we're now at a level where the movement, our movement, and the social movements generally, have to be more literate about these things. They need to be more technically aware of what's going on in order to intervene in the discussions and in the debates. And that is going to be, for the next 20 or 30 years, the energy transition is going to be full of mistakes, full of controversies, full of misrepresentation. And the public pathway approach says, let's put all the scientific evidence on the table. What do we know about these technologies? What have we heard about certain potential? Will it succeed? Will it not succeed? If it's done on the basis of science and facts and rigorous examination, that is an important contribution a public pathway model can make. If it's done on the basis of a lobbyist who's saying, I can solve the energy transition, I can solve climate change with my little technology, just throw a few billion rand at me and I'll show you how it's done. That is what we've been doing now for the last 20, 30 years, and it's been disastrous. And I can point to, I don't have the time to go into all of them, but I can refer to biofuels in the US, cost hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies, and they found out it generates more greenhouse gas emissions than petroleum because of all the inputs that go into growing the corn. Anyway, comrades, I'm reminded of, I remember the 1980s, when the scenario was that hundreds of millions of people were going to die of AIDS. They said that the drugs were too expensive and that poor people in countries like South Africa were going to basically die. And the government here at the time, led by activists, fought at the global level for the release of for the ending of the intellectual property restrictions on antiretrovirals, which saved tens, perhaps potentially hundreds of millions of lives, not just here, but all around the world. That's the approach we need to the energy transition. This is a life-threatening, civilization-threatening condition, if you like. Then we need the same kind of audacity and bravery in order to deal with it. There will be problems. I'm looking at the chat. Comrades are raising issues like, well, isn't solar variable? Why don't we do rooftop solar? And how do we do that? All of those technical challenges need to be acknowledged as real. Let's not be dismissive of the concerns of people who say maybe renewables aren't the solution. Then we have to find what the solution is. What other possible sources of low carbon or zero carbon energy are there? How can we develop the technologies in a way that they become part of the public assets and we have meaningful democratic representation in deciding on what technologies are developed? And that's the supply side. On the demand side, it's not going to be easy to control energy use. But we do know if there is a general acceptance that this is a civilizational emergency and states and utilities have a mandate to control how energy is used, there is a lot of things that can be done in terms of reducing unnecessary energy use. Think of all the advertising you see, think of all the unnecessary lighting you see, think of like all the unnecessary products that are produced that we really take up a lot of energy. So there are things we can do. Digitalization is another possibility. At the moment, it's left to individual companies and consumers whether they buy these digital devices, but that could be the job of a public utility. So that the control of electricity by the public de facto means control over private consumption of energy, because you can pull the plug on a private producer in a blink of an eye. If they violate certain rules, it's not a regulation, they're going to issue a lawsuit and they pay a fine. You turn the energy off. You turn the energy off. Right there, right there. And then you'll see how quick the private sector will move in order to address, this new challenge. That's the way we can control energy use. So I think there is a lot to discuss. We've just really scratched the surface, but I've enjoyed the presentation.
Great. Thanks very much. Dominic, can I hand over to you?
As AIDC, I think we credit a lot of the thinking and approach to this work to Tuet and Sean. I think it's excellent that we're having to help us think about how we take forward energy transitions. I want to make a couple of closing remarks. And there's some technical questions. How do we deal with debt? And can we push for cancellation of debt? Which I think we can, but it will require regime change, and we should be pushing for cancelling illegitimate and corrupt debts. But all of this begs the question of power. Similarly, and I think it goes back to the points comrades on the floor made, and how we take this information and make it meaningful to people who can advance a public pathway perspective. And I think in that regard, we're very much on the back foot. And in as much as the energy debate is technical, I think it's even more contested, right? Because it forms the heart of the unfolding of the way the economy, the future of the capitalist economy, new modes of accumulation. And so I think the question of power is critical to that, and how we translate this into meaningful action is key. I think in this discussion, we only touched on it, and some people have raised it in the chat, but the unions are going to play a central role in being able to contest the current narrative, which I think there is no alternative, right? Going back to the grandmother of neoliberalism, Margaret Thatcher, to the private sector, to austerity, etc. And given our subjective weakness at the moment, the weakness of popular forces and trade unions, it makes it hard to push for a different approach. And the fact that the state is so discredited makes it doubly hard. And so we really are up against the gum tree. And so I think what the real question is two things for me. One, we have to go through these technical questions, and there's more of them, and we can go deeper and deeper into the different aspects of the issue. Because it's not just energy, it's energy within a political economy and within a broader geopolitical economy that I think we need to understand. But then the second question is, so how are we going to contest power so that these questions can actually be meaningful? Because at this stage, the privatization is going to go ahead at this stage without contestation. The continuation of a municipal financing model that continues energy poverty will continue, etc. So that's the question I think we have. But having said all of that, what I think we can say is that we have the facts to show that there is an alternative. Unfortunately, we don't have the vehicle to advance that yet. And so that's, for me, what we need to put a lot of emphasis on. Thanks so much for your time.
Okay, so thanks very much, everyone. I think just to round up, I think what's very clear coming out of this seminar is that the way forward is going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. But I think as Sean has shown, change is not only possible, it's happened in the past, great change, considerable change, and I think it's something that is possible in the future. So we can envisage that change and we can make that change happen. I think it comes down to mobilization, organization. And so I think the kind of suggestions that were coming out about workshops about popularizing these issues, popularizing this material, making clear what is quite technical. I think that is one of the very concrete current challenges that we face at the moment. So thanks very much, everyone. Thank you to those online for your patience, and thank you to our speakers.
And thanks to Sandra.
Oh.